There's no doubt that multitasking of pretty much any kind is going to have that negative effect.
So let's underline this. So multitasking decreases memory. Welcome to the Brain Fit Podcast, where we share the cutting-edge science on how you can improve your memory and live a happier, healthier life. My name is Robert Love. I'm a neuroscientist and have a medical clinic in Florida where we are reversing Alzheimer's in our patients. This week's episode is with Dr. Daniel Schacter. Dr. Schacter is a professor at Harvard University, and he specializes in memory. In this episode, he's going to share with you what causes good memory, so how you can improve your memory, what hurts your memory so you can avoid it, and some ways that you can reduce your risk of Alzheimer's disease. So here is the interview with Dr. Daniel Schacter. Welcome to the podcast. We have a wonderful show with you today. Today, I'm bringing Dr. Daniel Schacter, a professor from Harvard, to talk about his research on learning and memory. Not only going to learn the cutting edge research on learning and memory, but also things that you can do to improve your memory, to live a happier, healthier life, and hopefully reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease. Dr. Schacter's bio is extremely impressive. I'm just going to cut to the heart of it here so you can understand what he's been up to. So Dr. Schacter is a professor of psychology at Harvard University. His research has examined the relation between explicit and implicit memory, the nature of memory distortions, and how memory is related to future thinking, imagination, creativity, and the effects of aging on memory. He's published over 500 articles, and he has a groundbreaking book that is now in its second version, The 7 Sins of Memory. And I think that's going to be most relevant to us today. Dr. Schacter, thank you so much for being here.
Glad to be here and look forward to our discussion. Thanks for having me.
So let's get right into it. Tell us, what do we need to know? First of all, writing the book 7 Sins of Memory. I'm sure you learned a lot more than your own research in putting together this book. What did you learn about learning and memory in putting together this book, and with the focus on what can we do as adults, in particular as adults who are aging, to protect and improve our memory?
Good questions. My first engagement with the book on the 7 Sins of Memory was right around 1999, 2000, when I had started doing some research in the lab on ways in which what we remember can be distorted or result in error, and looking at cognitive aspects of that, and looking at what's going on in the brain when we remember something but remember it incorrectly. So this got me really interested more generally in thinking about the different ways in which memory can break down or is subject to error. And I realized back then that nobody had really put together sort of the entire landscape of memory errors. And so I sort of set about that as a task for about a year of just reading the literature and trying to see if I could come up with some way of organizing it. And then I came to the conclusion that there were these 7 basic categories of memory error, memory malfunction, and I couldn't resist the analogy to the classic 7 ancient deadly sins. So I call them the 7 Sins of Memory, although as we'll discuss, one of the takeaways from the book is that although I call them sins, they're not really all bad. They're actually aspects of memory that reflect adaptive memory processing, but they're kind of a price we pay for that adaptive memory processing. In any event,
so that's really interesting. So I want to slow down there because that's a fascinating concept. There's a price we pay in our memory to basically operate faster in the world, kind of like heuristics. So stereotypes aren't always accurate, but they can be helpful in getting us through the world in a faster way. Similarly, you found that we sacrifice perfect memory, or I guess perfectly accurate memory, in order to function in an easier way in the world. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think in broad terms that's correct. And it depends on which of these 7 sins we're talking about. So let's start with the 3 that have to do with different kinds of forgetting. Right. So I call them sins of omission because they reflect situations in which we're forgetting, although I argue that there are different mechanisms involved in these 3 different sins of omission. I call them transience, absent-mindedness, and blocking. Okay, so transience is But we all know that all other things being equal, memories tend to fade over time. It's harder to remember what happened a year ago versus a day ago, all other things being equal. Absent-mindedness also is forgetting, but forgetting that occurs for different reasons, kind of a breakdown at the interface of attention and memory. And then finally, blocking is another kind of forgetting, but this occurs when we're paying attention. Information is still in memory, but we just can't get at it at the moment that we want to. Kind of like a tip of the tongue experience. You feel that the information is there, and it actually is there, but you can't retrieve it at the moment that you want to. So all of these can cause different kinds of problems in everyday life. For the most part, when people complain about forgetting, they're usually complaining about what I call transience, that they're not able to retain information over time as well as they used to be. So
what do you think of the work of Ebbinghaus? Because that was
yes, Ebbinghaus was kind of the classic first study way back in the 19th century in 1885. Of course, a German psychologist who studied his own memory and obtained some results that turned out to be pretty generalized to other people, and one of which, the most famous of which, and I think what you're probably alluding to, is the curve of forgetting. So he tested himself and he found that his memory dropped off really quickly in the first 24 hours after learning lists of nonsense syllables, and then the rate of decline slowed down after that. And that turns out to be, it doesn't hold for all kinds of information in all situations, but turns out to be pretty general observation.
Now, is that basically what you found, loss of memory due to transience, of losing memory over time, not because they didn't encode it properly or pay attention or something's blocking, but just over the course of time?
Exactly. That there are things you can do to combat transience, but all other things being equal, information is going to fade. We understand maybe a little bit about the underlying neural machinery that is related to that. But to come back to the adaptive perspective, one of the points I try to make is that although all these kinds of forgetting can be annoying and actually sometimes dangerous, from an adaptive perspective, we have to ask the question, as several researchers in the literature have, would we want a memory system that preserves all information, important or unimportant?
Yeah, what's your thought on that, Dr. Schacter?
No, we don't, is my general thought on that, and that of others in the field. That's one of the reasons why we may forget, because we're not going to retain every trivial detail of every experience, because that information typically is not really relevant for many future situations.
If you are having trouble sleeping, I have a great supplement I want you to know about. It's called Roar Lion's Mane. So lion's mane has many different benefits for the brain and for the body. Lion's mane improves memory. Lion's mane reduces stress, reduces anxiety. It helps slow down aging by lowering inflammation, and it helps with sleep. It helps you fall asleep faster, stay asleep longer, and fall back to sleep. I learned about lion's mane about 5 years ago when I was having trouble sleeping. When I took it, after about a week, I noticed that I was sleeping better and I was able to fall back to sleep, and I was having vivid dreams, which is really cool. And now I take lion's mane 5 to 6 nights a week. And I do this because it helps me fall back to sleep. So when I wake up, I'm no longer anxious when I wake up, and I'm able to kind of lay still in bed and fall back to sleep. And I get vivid dreams, which I really like, and it improves my REM sleep. So if you'd like to try some of my Roar Lion's Mane risk-free, go to roarlionsmane.com or robertlove.net to learn more.
Have you seen these 60 minutes of these people who have those? Mm-hmm. Isn't it fascinating that none of them really seem to be that happy? And it's interesting, if I had this superpower of remembering everything, I would try to learn things that would help me in my career, in my profession, and what I'm doing. And I don't see them doing that. I see them kind of overwhelmed with just the burden of remembering every single fight they had with their partner and the dates that all these things happen in their lives, rather than trying to put in information that's useful. They're kind of just they're just overwhelmed with all the information of their lives.
Yeah, that's a good observation. They're a really interesting group. What are known today as people with highly superior autobiographical memory. And as you allude to, and maybe many people in your audience have seen those 60 Minutes interviews and others, they seem to be able to remember on cue almost any particular episode that's happened to them. Now, they don't have photographic memories. They can't tell you everything that happened about any particular episode any more than you or I could. But what's remarkable is that they have access to many more episodes than you or I would. And from the research that's been done, what seems to be going on is that they basically have found a way to slow down transients that we're just talking about. So if you ask one of these folks about something that happened maybe an hour ago or a day ago, or even a few days ago, they're not going to remember much differently than you or I would. What is different is that a year later or several years later, they'll still remember the episode very well. For you or I, most likely, unless it's something really important, that the information will have faded away. So, as you point out, though, raise the question: well, how do they do this, and are they doing this at the expense of?
Do we know the neurochemistry of this? Do they just have like a ton of acetylcholine, or are they just really imprinting their memories very strongly day to day, different than the average person? What's happening here?
Here, what I think is happening, we know a little bit about the underlying brain structures, which might be slightly different between these folks and others, but I think most of what's happening has to do with their interest in and almost obsessive retrieval of their past personal experiences, going over, retrieving, reviewing their past much more extensively than most of the rest of us do. Now, there's an important lesson here, because when we think about transients, one of the things we would all, be interested in is anything that would slow down transients, slow down the rate of forgetting, particularly for information we want to remember. For example, a student studying for a test, they don't want to lose information over time. And sort of in parallel to this work on the highly superior autobiographical memory folks, there's been a resurgence of interest over the last 20 years in cognitive psychology in something known as the testing effect. Others call it retrieval practice. And basically, what the research shows is that if you test yourself, for example, on recently studied information, or test yourself on the events of the day in your daily life, the act of retrieving information is something that has a specific effect in slowing down the rate of forgetting over time. This has been shown in numerous studies, for example, of young adults who are studying stories. And you can ask the question, if you just restudy the story over and over again, is that the most effective way of promoting long-term retention? How about if you compare that to a situation where you study the story and then you get tested repeatedly on aspects of the story? What this research shows is that at very brief intervals, you might be better off just studying over and over again, cramming in other terms. But if we test you at increasingly longer delays, what we see is that people who acquire the information by studying and then getting tested on it, that information holds up much better over time, and it reduces transients. So this is kind of a parallel.
Because it causes us to have to go and retrieve the memory rather than just reviewing the information.
Exactly. And this is a parallel to the folks with highly superior autobiographical memory. That's kind of what they're doing obsessively about events in their daily lives in a way that other people aren't.
Are these kind of low level? You mentioned the word obsessive. Would they be diagnosed as such in their repetitive retrieval of their daily information? So it's not necessarily that they have not necessarily better memory, but they're constantly going over their lives and constantly reviewing all these things. And this actually seems to be maladaptive. These people seem to have low levels of happiness. I think most of the people on there were divorced.
Some of them, not all of them. Some of them do, but you're exactly right in your characterization of it, in that there is research showing a link between this having highly superior autobiographical memory and scoring high on measures of obsessive compulsive behaviors. Not necessarily clinically OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, but showing higher scores than average on measures of obsessive compulsive disorders, as if they're obsessively and compulsively retrieving and organizing their memories, and that makes them robust to the effects of transience.
So it's a matter of reviewing inside their own minds.
I would like to thank our sponsor, Microingredients. All of Microingredients products are third-party tested, so you know they are the highest quality. I've been using Microingredients products for the past 2 years before they were sponsored the show because they are so high quality. They have a great collagen supplement. This helps reduce wrinkles. It's great for your skin, hair, and nails. MCT oil is great for your brain. I love to add this to my coffee. Collagen is also good in the coffee. The organic blueberry mix, I add that to my smoothies and desserts. Their new curcumin supplement is excellent. MCT oil is one of my favorites. It stands for medium chain triglyceride oil. This is basically coconut oil on steroids. When you add this to your coffee, it basically replaces dairy in your coffee. That's really good for you. And the MCT oil becomes energy for your brain. And so people notice an improvement in memory. They notice improvement in brain fog. Research in patients with Alzheimer's disease who take MCT oil, it improves their memory. Dr. Dale Bredesen, who wrote the book, The End of Alzheimer's, recommends 3 tablespoons of MCT oil a day. Don't start there. Start smaller and then work up. If you take too much, you can get disaster pants. This is my favorite MCT oil. Let me tell you why. Number 1, USDA organic coconuts, very important. Number 2, it is third-party tested like all Microingredients products. Number 3, it's a powder. So the powder is more gentle on your stomach than the MCT oil liquid. So this is great. And then lastly, it has prebiotic fiber. So it feeds your good gut bacteria. If you'd like to try some of Microingredients MCT oil, go to Amazon and then search MCT oil and then use the code RobertLove at checkout to save 10%.
So let's apply this now for most adults. So most adults age 60 and over. In fact, I'm shocked. I don't know if you're finding this in your students. I'm shocked how many young people are coming to me with memory trouble. I think a lot of it's from mold exposure or too much exposure to the smartphone, and their attention's bad. But people, generally speaking, really want a better memory. And so how can we use this science to help people improve their memory? Is it regular testing at the end of a day or at the end of a week with their journal to review what they learned and who they had lunch with and what they did? Or what do you think? How can we use this information to help people improve their memory throughout the lifespan?
I think exactly what you suggest, doing the kind of self-review and self-testing, but targeting it for something that's important. You don't want to repeatedly retrieve information that is just going to be kind of a burden, is unimportant, is not highly relevant to your personal life. But for those things that you do want to remember, self-testing I think is the best way to slow down the rate of forgetting over time. For students, I encourage students who are taking my courses and students who are reading textbooks and so forth to engage in as much of this self-testing as possible, because that is what is going to allow you to retrieve information over time in the most efficient way. And it also applies to older adults as well.
So perhaps a regular routine of writing down in detail on a daily basis or maybe once every other day what they want to remember, and then testing themselves on that in the future. So they have a record of what actually happened, and then they can review it. And then hopefully they're only writing down things they want to remember. They don't write down fights that they had with their spouse. I don't know why you'd want to remember that. I don't think that leans towards happiness, but writing down the things that are important and then reviewing that over time, and that will help strengthen those memories.
Exactly. Right. It's pretty simple and it's very effective.
Now, how many people are doing this? Which is fascinating to me, because it is simple and it's very effective. But how many people are regularly reviewing? Even students at Harvard, I'd love to know how many of them are regularly reviewing their notes at the end of the day and at the end of the week and at the end of the month, so that way when exams come, they're not cramming. I remember at Swarthmore, I don't know anyone. Maybe there's 1% of the class that was doing that, but pretty much we're right. Doing our work the night before. And then, we're kind of doing the minimal amount of work we can throughout the semester until it's exam time. And then we're all very unpleasant people who don't sleep very much studying. I don't know if it's still the case, but I'm guessing it still is. So a lot of smart people aren't doing these things, even though, as you said, it's very powerful and it's very simple. Yeah, exactly. I think, for testing, there is some benefit to cramming, but if you, for an immediate test, but if you want to retain that information over time, the self-testing and retrieval practice is far superior. And certainly for events of our everyday lives, there's really no reason for cramming or rationale for cramming. For most of us, we're just letting those things pass. And I think that we often don't realize at the time we have an experience how likely it is that maybe a year later
We're not going to be able to remember this experience, even though we would like to. We think it has some importance, and we have to take an active role, as you suggest, in promoting that retention over time. But I think very few people do it. I don't have good data on how many do, but I think the percentage would be low.
My grandmother I think she had an interesting strategy. Like many people, she would collect cards that people sent them for events. And, just go, I keep birthday cards and, so forth. And just reading those reminds me kind of the people who wrote them, but also of the events. I recently reread an email I wrote my dad for Father's Day, which was really well thought out, because I wanted to just reaffirm that. I hope he remembers it as well. But we're losing those physical cards as far as remembrances of ways to remember dinner parties that people write us for, or events that we have in our life. I want to get back to absent-mindedness. I think that's very interesting to people. But first, I want to just go at a little bit of a diversion here. I'm curious what your experience is as a professor teaching young students. Have you noticed a change as technologies become more ubiquitous on attention? I had an uncle who taught economics at St. John's, and he said at the end, teaching was very difficult. He said the attention span was extremely low. It was hard to get them to pay attention in class, and he said it was very, very, very different. I was wondering what your experience is.
It's a really good question, and I haven't studied it in my classroom specifically. Based on my casual observation, I tend to agree. I think there are tendencies in that direction. I have read the literature on this pretty closely, and in fact, in the updated version of The Seven Sins of Memory, so the original book was 2001, then I updated it in 2021.
So it's a very, very new edition.
Yeah, there's a very new edition. And in that edition, what I do is I for each of the seven sins, I look at two areas of research that I think are particularly important or interesting, or where we've made progress over the last 20 years. And in fact, one of those for transients, I talk about exactly what we just discussed, the highly superior autobiographical memory, the testing effect, and the relationship between the two. For absent-mindedness, as well as for transients, I talk about the question of the effect of technology on memory and attention, because that has become so much more relevant over the last 20 years. Now that, in 2001, when I wrote the original Seven Sins of Memory, the iPhone didn't exist. It was still, roughly 6 years away. Now we all have our iPhones, and we're much more connected to the world through online sources in a way that we were to some extent in 2001, but not nearly as much as now. In any case, you can read a lot of kind of panicky headlines in the newspaper about, an encroaching digital amnesia, or are we all losing our memories as a result of relying on these external devices so much. And I think there is something to it, but there is not yet really strong evidence that there's a broad-reaching effect on memory of relying on technology. Let's take one example, the most relevant, I think, to absent-mindedness and attention, and this is the topic of multitasking and media multitasking in particular. So those of us who are doing lectures in classrooms are somewhat dismayed when our students may have a computer screen up and we look on the other side, and we like to think that they're hanging on our every word and taking notes. In fact, they may be looking, at your YouTube interviews, or they may be doing online shopping, or they may be doing other things. So the question is, what effect does this kind of multitasking have on memory? Now, what's absolutely clear, and is an extension of earlier work on the effects of divided attention on memory, is that for any particular task or information we want to acquire, if we're multitasking as we're taking that information in, we're going to have reduced memory for that information. The information's never really getting into the memory system in a way that's going to allow it to be explicitly, consciously retrievable later on. So there's no doubt that multitasking of pretty much any kind is going to have that negative effect.
So let's underline this. So multitasking decreases memory. It decreases our ability to strongly encode that memory and be aware of actually what's happening, which will decrease our ability to retrieve that memory in the future.
Right. Exactly.
If you or someone you love has Alzheimer's or another form of dementia, I want you to know there is hope. Alzheimer's is preventable and it is even reversible. In fact, we are reversing Alzheimer's in my medical clinic here in Florida. My partner and medical director is Dr. Josh Hellman, a medical doctor trained at Harvard who specializes in preventing and reversing Alzheimer's disease, and we are reversing Alzheimer's in our patients. If you'd like to learn more about working with us to both prevent Alzheimer's and even reverse Alzheimer's and reverse memory loss associated with other forms of dementia, we would love to hear from you and send you some free information so you can learn what we are doing and see if it's a fit for you to come down and work with us in our clinic. We also work with other clinics around the country to help patients both prevent Alzheimer's as well as to reverse Alzheimer's and reverse memory loss associated with dementia. So if you'd like to learn more, go to brainpowerclinics.com. Go to brainpowerclinics.com and then enter your information. We will send you some free information, and then we hope to work with you if we can be helpful to you to help you prevent and reverse Alzheimer's disease.
For the task at hand. Now, the broader question, which is I think the one you asked at the beginning, is all this multitasking having an even more general effect such that, people's ability to attend and remember in a very general sense is being degraded, or that even if I'm a frequent multitasker or media multitasker, using different kinds of media to multitask, does that mean that even when I'm not engaged in the act of multitasking at the moment, that my memory now is going to be very degraded? Because of all this multitasking, I'm just losing my ability to establish new memories. There, the evidence is less clear. There is evidence that people who are characterized as frequent media multitaskers, who do this kind of thing a lot, do more poorly on some memory tests, even when they're not engaged in the act of media multitasking at the moment. And so that might suggest to you, well, boy, all that media multitasking has degraded their memory abilities. But there's kind of another interpretation of it, which is that the reason why people who are frequent media multitaskers, have the reason why they've gotten to be that way is because they have very poor attentional abilities to begin with. So of course, people, who begin with poor attention, engage in lots of media multitasking, are going to score poorly on memory tests that require attention, which includes most memory tests. So there's a chicken and egg problem, correlation causation problem that hasn't been solved in the literature yet as to what's causing what.
If we see that as a cohort effect, then I think that's much easier to say. But there's also other things that affect that cohort, like environmental toxins and other things that happen as they grew up and matured and their brains matured. But goodness gracious, I hope that argument isn't being put out to continue to encourage parents to allow their kids to have smartphones. I'm doing my very best. Well, I think I'm doing my very best to tell people, listen, I would not give my child a cell phone. The only reason, children don't need cell phones. They're not likely to be kidnapped on their way to school. Like, we really don't need these. This is not a safety issue, and it's really destroying their memory. It's also destroying their dopamine levels, the way they experience the world. It's so rewarding to get a text message or to have access to games designed to spike dopamine, or access to pornography on our phones. And then it's really hard to relate to the beauty of a tree or a healthy relationship for that age group. I'm really concerned with what these devices are doing as far as the dopamine reward system.
Yeah, I think there's a reason for concern. Again, it's a complex, situation. We don't know what's causing what. And I don't think we have at this broadest level really strong, evidence on the broadest effects, particularly on memory, for the reasons that I said. Another good example, even, there's definitely, reason to be concerned. Another good example, it's one I talk about in the updated Seven Sins book, and in a couple of other articles I've written where I go into it in even more detail, has to do with the GPS use. So most of
I
us,
love GPS.
yeah, we
I
love
used to get
GPS,
lost
right?
so often, and now it's
Exactly.
so easy for me to navigate the world. I love it so much.
Right. So, and you say, well, how could I have gotten around before I had GPS to rely on? What was it? How did I get from point A to point B? Did I always bring a map with me? In any event, so we love GPS. It gets us from point A to point B. The question is, by relying on GPS, are we unintentionally degrading, let's say, our spatial memory ability or even our more general memory ability? Because rather than having to map out a route and remember, okay, you make a left here and you make a right there, now I'm just told by my phone what to do, and I do it. So, what is the effect of GPS use on
Yeah.
memory?
I think that's reasonable. The London taxi cabbers who have a larger brain because of their testing, it shows that the size of the brain decreases when they retire. Now, for me, when I drive, I just put on the GPS because then I don't need to think about driving in particular places, and I can actually listen to a podcast. I can actually do other learning while I'm driving. So my visual spatial memory of how to get places is not great, even where I live. And I've used that time to actually increase my study and my learning time. So I've substituted the value of spatial memory of where I live with other intellectual learning.
Right, and there could be some compensation there. The London taxi drivers are interesting because for people who may not know, there are these well-known studies conducted by Eleanor McGuire and her colleagues about 20 years ago, showing that if you measure the size of the hippocampus, which is a structure that's really important for new learning and memory and for spatial processing, the volume of the hippocampus is larger in London taxi drivers than in people who don't drive taxis. And the chicken and egg problem was kind of solved in those studies, because they showed that it was experience dependent. So it wasn't just that people who have a large hippocampus are more likely to become London taxi drivers. Rather, the hippocampal volume increased as a function of experience. So that's a link going in a positive direction. So now you might say, okay, well, if that's established, are we all becoming like the inverse of the London taxi driver, where by virtue of not relying on maps and learning spatial locations and doing all the things that made London taxi drivers as knowledgeable about the spatial environment as they are we unintentionally, producing an atrophy in our own hippocampi? So what's the state of the research on it? There's not a lot. There's a little bit. Now, consistent with what you're saying, and as we might expect, if we're relying on GPS, it's clear that we're going to have worse memory for the route that we just took than if we are not relying on GPS and we're trying to figure it all out on our own, how to get from point A to point B. So that kind of a task-specific effect, if you will. But what we're really interested in is the more general question of, okay, I'm willing to not remember the route I just took as well as I might, and I might, if I'm substituting other productive activities during that time, as you mentioned. But what about this broader question? If I'm doing that all the time, am I just going to reduce my spatial memory abilities more generally? And there, the evidence, again, is at best suggestive. So there is some evidence that people who report relying on GPS over long periods of time tend to do worse on spatial memory tasks that don't involve driving with GPS, suggesting that, like with the media multitaskers, maybe these folks, as a result of relying on GPS, have poor spatial memory. But then we have the same alternative question coming up. Well, maybe it's just people who have poor spatial memory who are more likely to rely on GPS to begin with, and there's some evidence for that. So we still have a chicken and egg correlation causation problem to work out in that domain as well.
Very interesting. What do you think of the work of Kirk Erickson and colleagues? So Dr. Erickson had people, basically older adults, exercise. And he had two groups. One did exercise and one did stretching. I think it was about 6 months. They measured hippocampal volume before and after. Mm-hmm. And basically,
those who did regular exercise grew a bigger hippocampus. So what do you think of that research, and how can we, and how significant is that, that we can grow our brains with exercise as far as improving our memory?
Yeah, I'm familiar with that study. In fact, I teach it in my cognitive neuroscience class. It was a very well done study. The effects look pretty robust to me. And in fact, one of the bits of advice I think is reasonable to give older adults based on that study, some of the previous work with rats that led to that study, and other research since that study, which I think was published 2011, is that in fact, aerobic exercise as you get older is one of the ways, among the ways that you can promote memory function, given that there is evidence of increased hippocampal volume and increased performance on hippocampal sensitive tasks in that group that did, I think it was 340-minute walks a week, compared to a control group that was doing stretching exercises or non-aerobic exercise. So yeah, I'm a fan of that line of work. I think it hangs together pretty well, and there's been other work since corroborating that.
What else can adults, in particular aging adults, do to strengthen their memory and protect their memory? So you mentioned regular review, testing the memory, not multitasking. That can help reduce absent-mindedness. Exercise and can be helpful. What else based upon the science can people do to enhance their memory as they age?
I think all those would be my primary recommendations. I think the other thing, and this is something we've known about for a long time, and will boil down to a question of how much time and energy you want to devote to enhancing memory. We've known for a long time about encoding strategies that promote subsequent memory, making up vivid visual images, making up meaningful associations to link new information to things that you already know. Most of the popular books on memory, going back to the famous book, 50 years ago now, by Harry Lorraine and Jerry Lucas, called The Memory Book, rely on a lot of these mnemonic techniques. And these mnemonic techniques will work. A more recent example of this is the book by Joshua Furr. It's called Moonwalking with Einstein. And he's a writer.
Do you like that book? I thought that book was really fun.
Yeah, it's very entertaining. He's a writer, and he got interested in how people can improve memory, and how there are now memory competitions that produce U.S. national and world memory champions who can memorize extraordinary amounts of information. This is very different from the highly superior autobiographical memory folks we talked about earlier. These are not people who recall all their past experiences. They're really experts at acquiring vast amounts of new information. The HSAM, the highly superior autobiographical memory group, are not good at that at all. They're very average. But what these memory champions do is employ in a very rigorous way these techniques of creating visual imagery, creating memory palaces in your mind into which you put novel information. They become really good at that. And depending on how much time you want to put into it, you can, approach their level of performance. That was the sort of the final, the ending of Moonwalking with Einstein. Here's a writer who's a bright guy, but is not a particularly, a memory expert. And he learns these techniques and he wins the National Memory Championship. And the point is that almost anyone could do it. The question is, how much time do you want to spend on learning these techniques and using these techniques? It's all out there. It's been known, goes all the way back to the time of the Greeks, these mnemonic techniques. So it's no secret. It's nothing new. It's something that can be used. It's just something that I found in my experience, people will get all enthusiastic about and say, oh, I'm going to learn all these memory techniques. And then, a couple of weeks later, it's just too much cognitive effort to do it. And they put it aside. That's why I like the self-testing and review, because that's easy to do and actually something that people actually do.
Yeah. Have you found any colleagues who are also studying memory that do use mnemonics and memory palaces and so forth to enhance their memory, or are you aware of students using these techniques? I remember reading that book. I wish I knew that when I was taking school. I would have used it. At least I think I would have used it,
Yeah.
right? It would have been really helpful for school, where you're basically, you're in training to learn stuff and then regurgitate it or show that you understand it on a test. That would make a lot of sense. I don't take a lot of tests these days. I'm guessing you don't either. So there's not that strong motivation to really learn those things at that level.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I know occasional colleagues. I myself have occasionally relied on these things if there's something I think I want to remember, some set of facts I want to learn quickly, and I can come up with images. But again, I think the problem, the barrier is that for long-term use, they require a lot of cognitive effort that most people aren't willing to put into it.
It is a lot of effort. So I know we have just a little bit of time left. We're only through about 2.5 of your 7 sins of memory. So we talked about absent-mindedness and transience, and where should we go next? Should we go into blocking, or should we go into the other 4?
Let's talk a little bit about the sins of commission, because we haven't really talked about that at all, and they're really important in various ways, and link up to some of the work that I've actually been doing in the lab over the last 20 years. So let's focus on one. So there are 4 sins of commission. I call them misattribution, suggestibility, bias, and persistence. Persistence is kind of off on its own. Persistence refers to intrusive memories that result from traumatic or emotionally arousing experiences. We've all, had examples of persistence. I'll just mention it briefly because I think persistence really does illustrate this adaptive point that I started out talking about at the beginning. If we have a really upsetting or traumatic experience, the persistence of intrusive memories can be psychologically quite debilitating. It can keep us up at night. We can't keep it out of our mind. It seems like something that's really, really a negative feature of memory on the one hand, but on the other hand, we look at it from the adaptive point of view. We want a memory system that's going to preserve experiences that are traumatic and possibly threatening to our survival. So this is kind of the price we pay for having that sort of memory system, because we do tend to remember highly arousing, threatening, traumatic events extremely well. And that's a good thing, because that helps us in the future to avoid potentially threatening situations, but also can be psychologically quite devastating. The other 3 sins have to do with the cases when memory is present but wrong, where we misremember the past, and we might misremember it with high confidence. We might claim to remember something that happened that didn't actually happen. Or in the case of misattribution, we might claim, for example, to be able to identify someone as a culprit in a crime, claim to identify a person who it turns out didn't commit the crime, but looks like somebody who committed the crime. And we have a strong feeling of familiarity, say, oh, that's the person who did it, but we're really misattributing familiarity, perhaps from, seeing someone who looked like the suspect. And we know from studies of the Innocence Project that by far the single largest culprit in cases of wrongful convictions where people have been exonerated by DNA evidence is in these kinds of eyewitness misidentifications that often involve this, what I call this memory sin of misattribution. Why do we have this misattribution? Well, there are a couple of reasons for it. One reason, again, is that memory is really set up to allow us to remember the important things that have a lot of meaning to us, and we may get confused on some of the peripheral details. A nice example of this comes from an experimental paradigm that people who are listening who have taken psychology courses may be familiar with. It's something that's known in the literature nowadays as the Dease-Roediger-McDermott paradigm. This is something that initially discovered by the psychologist James Dease back in 1959. Nobody paid much attention to it then. And then in the 1990s, cognitive psychologists Roddy Roediger and Kathleen McDermott rediscovered this paradigm and expanded on it. And basically what it shows is that if I read you a list of semantically related words, you are very likely to later misremember having heard a word that is related to the ones I said, but is not one of the ones I said. So, for example, you may know this paradigm. If I read out the words candy, sour, sugar, bitter, good, taste, tooth, nice, honey, soda, chocolate, heart, cake, eat, pie, and then I give you a memory test and I say, was this word on the list? Taste. You may say, yeah, I think it was that was one of the ones that you just said, and you'd be right. And then if I say a word like point, was that on the list? I'd say, oh, no, that wasn't on the list. And then if I say the word sweet, most people will say, oh, yeah, sweet was one of those words that you just said. And they'll often say that with high confidence, when in fact, sweet was not on the list. But that's the word that all the ones I said are related to. So here's a very nice, tractable example of misattribution. All these words are related to sweet. You build up a lot of activation, semantic activation, if you will, for concepts related to sweet. You may even think of the word sweet during when I'm reading out those words, and later on you misattribute that strong feeling of recollection or familiarity to actually having heard the word when you didn't. And we and others have done brain imaging studies. We've looked at what's going on in the brain. When you remember these words, remember a word like sweet when you misremember it with high confidence. And a lot of the same things are going on in the brain when you remember the words that were really heard, that were really on the list, as compared to the words that you think were there, but were related to everything that were there. There are some differences, but there are also a lot of striking similarities. So why does this occur? Again, from an adaptive perspective, the idea would be that, when you say that sweet was on the list, what you're really reflecting, to some extent is your accurate memory that all these words had something to do with sweet. So your memory system has taken away the primary meaning from that list, but you've misattributed having heard sweet because you're not making a photographic record of exactly everything that happened that you can inspect later on. So I think that's one of the interesting lessons from work on misattribution, is that, again, this idea that, hey, we're not recording every single detail that happens. We don't want to record every single detail of our experience, but we can then be, tripped up in a situation like this and make this very dramatic, in some cases, misattribution error.
It's so interesting. I remember doing that in class and showing it. It's like, it was a list of animals. How many of you remember the word rabbit? Well, rabbit wasn't on the list. Like, how many of you thought it's very interesting how we think. Professor Schacter, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us and share with us. We barely scratched the surface of your book. This is really a lot of fun. Thank you for sharing these really valuable tips and things people can do to enhance their memory, and just the process of learning about learning and memory is just really interesting. And so, if someone wanted to learn more about your work, or someone wanted to get your book, The 7 Sins of Memory, that's available on Amazon.
Yeah. So if people are interested in the book, you can go to Amazon and you would look for The 7 Sins of Memory Updated Edition 2021, because that's 20 years later, and it has the original book in it, plus it has updates about the most important developments over the past 20 years.
Terrific. And then if people want to learn more about the research happening in your lab at Harvard, where would they go for that?
There, you would go to my lab website. I think the easiest way to do that is just type into Google or your favorite search engine, Schacter Memory Lab. That'll take you right to the lab website. And then you'll see tabs for people, for news, for publications. That has almost all our lab publications over the last 40 years, many of which are downloadable from links that are on the website.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much. This has just been wonderful.
I enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.